37 is that Joseph's brothers hated him. It comes out loud and clear. They hated their little brother Joseph. Sad indeed when you have a family that hates the younger brother or the older brother or the younger sister, whoever it might be. Tragic indeed. And they're out in the field and they're working together, and they all of a sudden, the brothers decide, this is our moment. This is our chance to kill our brother. They decide they're going to kill Joseph, and the first thing they do is joyfully remember that beautiful robe, that beautiful coat that Jacob gave his favorite son. Joseph was his favorite son, so that added fire to the pot. They hated him the most because Jacob loved him so much. So they couldn't wait to rip that beautiful robe, that beautiful coat of many colors off Joseph. And then they decided to throw him down in a cistern. Didn't have any water in it, but they tossed him down in that. And then they sat down to eat their lunch. And while they were eating their lunch, they were trying to figure out how they were going to kill him. And isn't it amazing how God is always on time? While they were eating their lunch, God sends this traveling band of gypsies, these Amalekites who are just passing through, and they start talking among themselves, and they say, well, we don't want his blood on our hands. Let's just sell him to this traveling group of Amalekites. So they get him out of the cistern, they sell him to the Amalekites, and the Amalekites are hauling away this 17-year-old boy away from the love of his daddy, away from his family, away from his homeland, way away, and Joseph doesn't have a clue where he's going. Where am I going? What's happening to me? What's going to become of me? How can my family do this to me? How can my own brothers, my own flesh and blood do this to me? So here he goes down the road, and they take him all the way to Egypt. And they get to Egypt, and they sell him to Potiphar, who's an official for Pharaoh. He's over the royal guard, and he has a nice big job and a big salary and a big house to take care of. And so he needs a good servant, so he buys Joseph, and Joseph becomes a slave. He becomes a servant in the house of Potiphar. And he's in the house of Potiphar, and so what does he do? Well, he does what we oftentimes all have to do. He did the best he could do. And oftentimes, we're all in situations, we're in ministries, we're in jobs, we're in relationships where we hang on and we do the best that we can do. And that's what Joseph set about doing for Potiphar. He became the very best slave, the very best servant that he possibly could. He gave it A+, 10 work every day. And Potiphar just knew that this was a man that he could trust because he was faithful. And he entrusted his entire house all over to Joseph. Only thing Potiphar had to worry about was just feeding himself. Joseph took care of everything. And so this went on for several years. Joseph really had a grand job in a lot of ways. He had a lot of freedom in being a servant, and that's how it all is with those of us who are in ministries. We are servants of God, and there's freedom in service. There's freedom in serving God and serving people. And he was very faithful in his service to Potiphar. Well, this went on for several years, but then things started getting a little wacky because Potiphar's wife couldn't take her eyes off Joseph. Joseph was obviously a very talented, good-looking young man, and Potiphar's wife just couldn't stop lusting after Joseph. And so time and time again, man, she is after him. And we read that time and again she's saying, Joseph, come and lie with me. Come and lie with me, Joseph. And Joseph refused her offers. He didn't want to have any part of that. And he tells her, look, I cannot be immoral with you. I cannot accept your invitation because your husband has been so good to me. He's given me the complete run of the house. I have complete freedom. I can't sin against my master by doing such a thing. And Joseph flees from her one day, and she grabs a piece of his clothing. And as she grabs his clothing, she starts crying out, that Hebrew, that man, he's tried to rape me. And what a terrible thing, because then Potiphar, what does he do? Potiphar, to save face, has Joseph thrown in the dungeon. Now, I don't believe for 1 minute that Potiphar believed what his wife was saying. I believe that Potiphar knew what kind of man Joseph was. He knew his character. He knew his faithfulness. He knew how committed he had been to his household, and that he didn't believe for a minute that Joseph had tried to rape his wife. But he had to save face. If he had really believed that Joseph had tried to rape his wife, he would have had Joseph hung. He would have had him executed. But in order to save face, he has Joseph put in the dungeon. That's a terrible place. And Joseph was in that dungeon for 2 years. And an acquaintance of mine said one time, he was in prison for 8 years for a drug problem. He said, when you're in prison for 8 years, it's every day. It's every day. And Joseph was in the dungeon for 2 years. And while he's in the dungeon, he meets 2 other slaves of Pharaoh. And these 2 slaves of Pharaoh, they're there for ticking Pharaoh off in some way. They're not going to be there long, but they're having dreams. And they can't figure out their dreams. And so they tell their dreams to Joseph, and Joseph hears their dreams, and he explains to them what their dreams mean. And they're really impressed by that because they come true. And Joseph says, now, when you get out of here, when you get out of this dungeon, will you please remember me to Pharaoh? And they say, oh, sure, we'll do that. Well, they get out of prison, and what do? They forget about Joseph. Out of sight, out of mind. You know, they don't remember him. They go on back. The chef, he doesn't live very long when he gets out. The other man who is the cupbearer or the butler for Pharaoh, he goes on. And then Pharaoh starts having dreams. And Pharaoh can't figure out what his dream means. And then all of a sudden, the butler remembers Joseph in prison. He said, now, when I was in prison, there was a young man by the name of Joseph who interpreted my dream. He's really good. Pharaoh said, bring him out. So they bring Joseph out, and Pharaoh shares with him his dream. And Joseph says, oh, wait a minute, I can tell you what that means. And being led of God, he explains to him, look, Egypt is getting ready to have a tremendous harvest. You're going to have food like you cannot imagine. You're going to have food galore. The grain is going to be incredible. But here's the problem. After those 7 years, you're going to have a 7-year drought. It's going to be like anything this world has never seen. It's going to be horrific. And so you must store that food from the 7 years of plenty to prepare for the 7 years of drought, because it's going to be tough. Well, Pharaoh was so impressed by Joseph's interpretation that he elevated him from the dungeon to the palace. And he ended up being the prime minister of Egypt. Now, friends, keep this in mind. Keep this in mind, that God has the ability to relocate you when he's ready. God has the ability to move you from the prison to the palace. Regardless of where you are in your ministry, regardless of where you are in your life, regardless of what valley you are in today, regardless of what hardship you may be enduring, regardless of how depressed or down you may feel today, you stick with the plan of God. You keep looking to God, because God has a great plan for you. And God was able to elevate Joseph right out of the dungeon into the palace, into a place of prominence where he was going to be used in a very phenomenal, significant way. Now, folks, let me just share a couple of things with you here. Problems happen to everyone. In this world, all of us are going to have adversity. All of us are going to have problems. So problems come to us all. What you are facing, what you are experiencing may be experienced by many other people, even in this room right here. We all are going to have health problems, domestic problems. We're all going to have financial issues. Life is filled with one problem right after another. Secondly, problems can come rapidly. Problems can come rapidly. They came at Job in just rapid succession, one right after another. There was one more problem right after another. And sometimes that's the way the problems and adversities of life are. They just come at us rapidly, sometimes from all different directions, and we think, I just can't bear it. I can't handle it anymore. They're coming so quickly. For Joseph, one day he was out in a field just working and doing his father's work, and the next thing he knows, he's in a cistern, and then he's with a traveling group of gypsies, and then he's sold to Potiphar as a slave, and then he's in the dungeon, and just one bad thing is happening right after another. Have you ever had a day like that? Have you ever had a year like that? Some of you are thinking, I've had a life like that. We never know. And sometimes they can come at us rapidly. Problems can also be very painful. And they usually are. If you're dealing with cancer, that's painful. If you're dealing with a diabetic problem, it's painful. If you're dealing with a neurological problem, it's painful. If you're dealing with a financial problem, if you have a child that's hurting, if you have a parent, an elderly parent that's suffering, it's painful. You see, the problems of life can be sometimes so painful. What Job was experiencing was so painful. Can you imagine what this young man, Joseph, how he felt the pain that he was going through? Don't you know that when he was thrown down in that dungeon, he had to be wondering, what are the people in Egypt saying about me? What are these people thinking about me? I'm not a rapist. I'm not an assault kind of person. I would never want to hurt anybody, but what are they saying about me? Can you imagine the pain that he was feeling? And he was probably thinking, when I get out of here, I'll never get a job. Nobody will want to hire me. Nobody will ever believe that I'm a good person. I'm useless. I have no use to life. I have no use. There'll be no way that I'll ever be useful to God. I'm tarnished. I'm broken. There's no hope for me. Oh, the pain that Joseph had to be going through. But friends, nothing is impossible with God. No matter how many people out here, how they may hate you, no matter how they may mistreat you, no matter how bad they beat you, no matter how they may treat you, they may terminate you from ministry, they may run you out of town, you may have a dozen losses in your life, but God can still use you. God still has a place for you in His service and in this life. That is what God is about. God was able to still use Joseph because God had a plan for Joseph. And people out here cannot thwart God's plan for your life. They'll say, well, we'll just ruin this person, or we'll do something bad to this person. We'll discredit this person. When we terminate this person, they'll never work in ministry again. When this individual's church fails, they'll never pastor a church again. All kinds of things that people oftentimes will do. Joseph's brothers, they thought, we'll never see old Joseph again. He's long gone. Oh, they're going to see him again. They're going to see him again. But they thought they had done away with him. How many people have thought, maybe back in your past life, they did you in? Boy, we did her in. We did him in. We fixed him good. And that you'll never serve again. Friend, God's plan is greater. God's plan is bigger, what God can do, than what man does. God is greater than man or the evils of man. And then oftentimes suffering and pain can go on for a long time. Joseph was at the age of 17 when he was sold into slavery. He was 30 years old when he finally got out of the dungeon and started serving in the house of Pharaoh. 17 years is a long time. The exiles were in Babylon. They were going to be there for 70 years. That's a long time to be dislocated. You may go through problems for a few days. Jesus, he was crucified. He was buried. On the third day, he arose from the grave. The stone was rolled away on the third day. But guess what? Your stone may not be rolled away in 3 days. Your stone may not be rolled away in 3 years. Because some of you will go through difficulties maybe your entire life. You may deal with type 1 diabetes your whole life. You may fight cancer for 20 or 30 years. You may have come down with a neurological issue that's going to impact you for the rest of your life. You may limp for 20, 30, or 40 years. You may have problems that you will never totally eliminate from your life. But God's grace is sufficient. And God's grace will see you through. Problems may go on for a long time, but God is still working His plan. Now I want you to see just one more point here. That in spite of all the problems and all the adversity and how painful they are and how long they last, God is still working His plan. Because God has a way of working through the pain. God has a way of continuing to work His plan. Now, see, I want you to understand something. This is very important. If Joseph's brothers had not hated him and thrown him into that cistern and sold him to the Amalekites, he wouldn't have ended up in Egypt. And if he hadn't ended up in Egypt, he wouldn't have ended up in the house of Potiphar. And if Joseph had not ended up in the house of Potiphar, he would not have been in a house where he was accused by Potiphar's wife of trying to rape her and ended up in a dungeon. And if Joseph had not been accused by Potiphar's wife of trying to do something really bad and ugly and ended up in that dungeon, if he hadn't ended up in that dungeon, he would not have met the two servants or the two slaves of Pharaoh. If he had not met the two servants of Pharaoh, he would not have heard their dreams and interpreted their dreams and impressed the cupbearer who would later stand before Pharaoh. If he had not interpreted the cupbearer's dream who later stood before Pharaoh, then the cupbearer who heard Pharaoh's dream would not have known Joseph. He never would have met Joseph. If he had not have met Joseph, then the cupbearer would never have told Pharaoh, I met a man in prison who impressed me by interpreting his dream. And if he had not told Pharaoh about meeting Joseph in prison who interpreted his dream, then Joseph would never have ended up in front of Pharaoh. If Joseph had not ended up in front of Pharaoh and interpreted the dream of Pharaoh and was able to tell Pharaoh about the phenomenal harvest that was coming, but yet the great famine that was coming, then there would never have been a great harvest. The great harvest would never have been preserved. If that harvest had not been preserved, all the people in Egypt and in that region and in the land of Canaan would have probably perished. And if the people in Canaan, including Joseph's family, Jacob and all his brothers, including Judah, if they had all perished in that famine, if they had all died or assimilated among the Canaanite people, Jesus Christ would never have been born. And if Jesus Christ would never have been born, you and I would be lost in our sins. And we would have no reason for being here today. But look and see, do you see the plan of God? Do you see the great plan that God had? When Joseph was thrown into that cistern, God was working His plan. When those brothers hated him, God still had a plan. When he was sold into slavery, God had a plan. When he was sold to Potiphar in Egypt, God had a great plan. When that woman was talking ugly about Joseph, God had a great plan. When Joseph was thrown into prison, God had a great plan. When Joseph stood before Pharaoh, God had a great plan. When that harvest, that great harvest came into existence, God had a great plan. And friend, God has a great plan for your life. God's working out His plan for you. God is speaking to you, and He's using all the bad stuff, all the bad things that have happened to you. There's a Bible verse in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. His brothers would get on their knees before him after Daddy Jacob died. Oh, when Jacob died, they were terrified. They thought, Joseph will lay it on us now. We're hurting now. Joseph will surely kill us. They fall on their knees after he's buried. Joseph, we are your servants. We are your slaves. We'll do anything. Joseph says, am I God? I'm not God. It's not my job to judge you. God in eternity will reveal, will take care of what your situation or your future scenario is. And then he said in verse 20, you meant to harm me, but God meant it for good. Which is being done now, the saving of many lives. Don't you see it? Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. What did Joseph have? Joseph had Romans 8:28. He had Romans 8:28. Romans 8:28 hadn't even been written. Paul hadn't even been born. He hadn't written Romans 8:28. But Joseph was able to write over his life After all these bad things have happened to him, terrible things have happened to him for so many years, all things work together for good to them that love God and who are the called according to His purpose. Joseph was able to see Romans 8:28 over his life. Friend, can you see Romans 8:28 over your life today? That God is working all things out together for good to them who love God. God is working out His plan in your life. Every December, I watch the same movie. It's titled, It's a Wonderful Life. And in that movie that was made in 1946 by Frank Buttra, thank you, made that wonderful movie. It was a colossal failure. It didn't make really any money at all. Got a few nominations, but it didn't do that good. And for about 30 years, that movie just languished. And then in 1975, that movie just took off because the copyrights wore off, for one thing, and TV stations just all over the country started playing it. And now every network in the month of December plays that movie 3 or 4 times, it seems, and you can watch it almost on every channel. But it's a story about George Bailey, who owned a savings and loan in Bedford Falls, New York. And he's just kind of a miserable kind of guy. He sort of hates his life. He doesn't really want to be stuck in Bedford Falls. He's tired of being in that little old town. He'd like to be out traveling and seeing the world. But no, he's stuck in Bedford Falls, and he's stuck running the family business, the savings and loan, and it's tough. But you know, people really respect him and admire him, but he can't see it. He's just really disgruntled and miserable with his life. And then things really get bad on Christmas Eve when Uncle Billy takes the $8,000. That's all the money that the savings and loan has. Remember, it's 1946. He takes the $8,000 to deposit it in the local bank that is owned and operated by a man named Potter. Not Potiphar, but Potter. And Potter is sort of a venomous, poisonous, evil banker kind of guy who's corrupt and sort of immoral. And somehow or another, Uncle Billy loses that $8,000 wrapped up in a newspaper, and it ends up on Potter's desk, and Potter hides it. Well, Uncle Billy runs home to George Bailey, the owner, and he's terrified. He's crying, I've lost the money, I can't find it. And George Bailey says, what do you mean? We've got to find that money. We've got to find that money. The money is lost. It's not to be found. And George Bailey just goes crazy on Christmas Eve. And he doesn't know what to do. He's disgruntled. He runs out. He goes on a drinking binge. And he knows his life is ruined. He knows he's going to be in prison. He knows his life is over. He knows his life is meaningless. He knows his life has no value. He knows he has no hope in life. And he's ready to go out to a bridge and jump off the bridge and kill himself. But in heaven, there's an angel by the name of Clarence Oddbody. And Clarence Oddbody is a second-class angel. Remember, it's a movie, folks. But he's a second-class angel. And he's sent by God down to try to talk some sense into George Bailey. And so Clarence Oddbody, he appears on the bridge, and when George is about ready to jump in the bridge and kill himself, Clarence jumps in before him and starts thrashing around in the water, save me, help me. So what does George do? He saves in to save this man that he doesn't know who he is. Pulls him out. They're on top of the bridge. They're in a little room getting warm and drying off, and George is just going on and on about how miserable his life is. I'd be better if I'd never been born. I'd be better off if I'd never existed. I'd be better off if I'd never lived. And Clarence, he has a little conversation with God, and he says, okay, George, we can arrange that. You've never existed. You've never lived. Well, George doesn't know what he's talking about, and he gets dried off and decides to go back out into Bedford Falls. And when he walks out into Bedford Falls, Clarence is following him, and George says, where am I? I don't recognize this place. And Clarence said, well, you're in Bedford Falls. He says, no, there's nothing here that even looks the same. Oh no, the town is drastically changed, George, because you never lived in this town to make the differences in this town. This is how the town really is, George, because you never lived. And then he came upon a grave. They were walking by the cemetery, and he saw it was his little brother, Harry. And he said, well, Harry shouldn't be here. I saved Harry from the pond. He was about to drown. He said, no, you didn't save Harry from the pond. Harry drowned in that pond because you weren't alive. You never existed, George, to save him. And then they came upon some other graves. And why are all these graves here? Some of these men, they were heroes in the war. Well, no, they never made it through the war, George, because they were bombed by a kamikaze pilot because your brother Harry never lived to rescue and save them from that bomber who was attacking the ship. And then they kept walking through other parts of the town that were dark and immoral and corrupt and falling apart. And Clarence, Oddbody the angel, looks at George and says, George, don't you see? George, you really had a wonderful life. You had a wonderful life, George. Look at the difference that your life made in this world. And George, he started crying and he said, oh, I want to live. I want to live. Oh, help me. I want to get back to life. I want to live. And his wish was granted, and he came back into reality, and he runs back home, and he hugs his wife. He hugs his children. All the people in town, they get together. They raise the money to save the bank from defaulting. And, yeah, they truly did live happily ever after. But the point today, dear friends, there are a couple of points, is that as you go from this place today, I want to ask you this question. Do you want to live? Do you want to live? Do you have a life to live? And do you have a life to live for Jesus Christ? And secondly, I want to say this to you today, graduating class. Every one of you have value. Every one of you have value. You are significant. You are important. You mean something. Your life is meaningful. You don't have a meaningless life. You don't have any semblance of a meaningless ministry. This is not a meaningless degree program that you've gone through. Friend, your life has meaning. Your life is real. You have a wonderful life. God has given you a life to live. I challenge you, graduating class, to go from this place and to live your lives for Jesus Christ. I challenge you to go from this place and know that wherever you go, wherever you preach, wherever you teach, wherever you counsel, wherever you organize, wherever you write, whatever you do for Jesus Christ, do it with meaning and purpose, because your life is meaningful and it is purposeful in Jesus Christ. Graduating class, will you accept this today? Will you accept this today? Will you accept God's great plan for your life? That He is working His plan. He is working His plan in your life right now. Will you accept God's grand plan for your life? God's plan, great plan to prosper you. God's great plan to give you hope. God's great plan to give you a great future. Graduating class of 2024, do you receive this message today? Do you receive it? And to amen, and to God be the glory.